Afternoon to you. It's great to have you here. This is a topic that I'm very, very passionate about, and working with architects is one of my favorite things to do. So really glad to have you for Protect Yourself, 3 steps to protect your AEC data from hackers. So my name is Josh Weiss. I started LA Creative Technologies a little bit over a decade ago. First learned about computers just playing video games with my dad. Never thought that I'd be talking about cybersecurity. After college, I spent some time living in Guatemala, where I built rural computer labs and taught computer classes. Still never really thought that security was going to be what I did in this industry at all. But something's been happening for the past number of years, which is that it's become more and more clear that there is no information technology without cybersecurity. They used to be different things, but at this point, what we're seeing is that this industry, sort of by manner of its existence, we need to focus on cybersecurity just to keep our clients safe. And once we're plugging in computers or turning on email systems in Microsoft or installing AutoCAD or whatever it is that we're doing, we have to do all of that with security in mind. So my story has morphed from one that was more about just loving technology and playing games and sort of liking the possibilities that technology brought, towards helping people to protect their data and their reputations and their livelihoods, because that's what needs to be done. And even more so as the pandemic hit over the last 18 months or so, and everyone started working from home and firms were closing their doors and having people bringing their potentially confidential projects off-site, the need for cybersecurity became greater than ever. One thing that I do want to add, sort of regarding my own story with technology, my very first business client that my company ever supported was a prestigious Los Angeles architecture firm. And so we've been working with architects since day one and really just love this industry. I'm a huge architecture fan, architecture buff, and sort of like LA history buff in general. And so my love of technology and security has always been very intertwined with architecture, since as a native Angelino, I just loved the built environment around me. So my goal is to secure and streamline technology for 100 organizations before 2023. And specifically in my love of working with architects, really just, there's a lot of things that we do that a lot of firms are not so together on, in terms of helping architects with hybrid storage in the cloud, the best laptops, and really just automating their practices and setting the right technology vision and budget planning for architecture firms. So we can go over a little bit more about that later. But really what I want to look at right now, before we get into the meat of this presentation, is some of the stories that we've been seeing around cybersecurity and architecture firms in 2021. And the first one is something that was pretty clear from the news. This was covered in Architectural Digest, but Zaha Hadid Architects, they had a major ransomware attack happen earlier this year, back in April, where someone encrypted and stole internal documents that included things like payroll, bank statements, contracts, email, etc. Now, this type of attack is really interesting to see because it made it in the news. Very, very few of the attacks that happen in the world these days will make it to the news. I know everyone sees big, high-profile incidents in the news. That's why I covered this one. But in this case, this company was very, very impacted. I know everyone has heard of Zaha Hadid. But moving forward from this one, I think what I want to do is cover some sort of day-to-day issues that we see in the line of our work. So what you see on the screen right now, this is an email. I was actually giving this same presentation that you're watching today last month. And about an hour before the presentation came in, one of the architecture firms that we support received the email that you're seeing on the screen right now. This is a real screenshot of the email that they got. And it was just a link to an invoice. And what happened was right there, click link to access document. What happened was that one of their main business development people, he clicked on that link. Unbeknownst to him, this was a phishing email, which we're going to cover in great detail in this presentation. He clicked on this link, and then the next thing you know, he sent out from his email address about 5,000 phishing messages of his own that looked just like this one. Pretty embarrassing, pretty expensive for anyone else who may have clicked it and caused an issue. So this one, pretty inconvenient, maybe not great for your reputation, but not going to damage your bottom line too badly. The next one, this was an email that was shared with me by another one of our architecture clients. This was sent to them by a national MEP firm that they work with. The firm who sent it to me is a small downtown LA firm, but this was a larger national MEP firm. And essentially what this says is that the company had lost access to all of their documents and all of their calendar invites. And they were able to dig through their email attachments and find most of the documents they needed, but they didn't even have the recurring calendar invite for the meetings, for the coordination meetings between their companies. And what they also mentioned down here, highlighted in yellow, is that they were hacked by a group called DarkSide. And I had actually never heard of DarkSide myself back in March, but they said you could look it up on Google. We did a little research and okay, DarkSide is a big hacking firm. This was March 22nd. So about 2 months later, on the cover of the Wall Street Journal, I think this was May 12th, month and a half after that, we could see on the cover of the Wall Street Journal that this same organization, hacking organization called DarkSide, had hacked the Colonial Pipeline and shut down the Eastern Seaboard. And it was really interesting to me to kind of watch that progression of how my small client was impacted by their partner getting hacked, and how that same company was able to pretty much shut down the East Coast for a couple of days. So what we're looking at are complex things, larger multinational architecture firms getting hacked, small companies here in downtown LA just getting, having their email address hijacked to send out messages, and really pretty major impacts to pipelines. So that's what's going on. It can look like losing access to your data. It can look like very embarrassing things happening to your company. There's a lot of different ways that this can play out. But the reason that I'm here today is because it really doesn't matter how many resources your company has. You may have a great IT provider or a great IT person on staff. Unless you really know what the potential impacts are and sort of how to use all your tools correctly, they're not necessarily going to do that much to protect you. And what we don't want, I know everyone is trying to come back to the office. All the firms that I work with are kind of back, but shutting down again due to breakthrough cases, and we don't really know what's happening. So, this graphic to me, what it means is that people are working in different places and are not necessarily so well protected. And we don't want to see them with sad faces, because I'll tell one more story. This happened back in November 2020 during the pandemic. A firm that I spoke with just last week, they had actually had all their remote employees' computers encrypted by ransomware. So they told me they weren't too sad. The data was all backed up. They got all their data back, but none of their employees could work while they tried to rebuild all their machines. And that's really what this slide kind of shows to me, is people are everywhere, on the beach, at home, at the office. But if they all get bad stuff on their computer and can't work, it's going to be very, very sad and expensive for the company. So all that said, let's look at what we're going to cover today. We're going to cover three things. And the first is that basically 85, 90% of attacks these days, they are starting with a phish. We're going to look at why that is, the evolution of cybercrime, and why phishing is so rampant and often so successful. We're going to look specifically at the methods that people who craft phishing emails are using. It's changed a lot since the pandemic started. And, as I give this presentation, I watch the pandemic sort of ebb and flow. And I know that these tactics are really just as relevant as ever. Finally, we're going to look at why to be careful with free Wi-Fi as you're traveling, if you are going to hotels or conferences. And we're also going to cover some very, very specific things for AEC firms, both during the slides as I present, and at the end, we are going to go into depth onto some specific suggestions for AEC firms. So let's start with, it always starts with a phish. And why are people phishing? It wasn't so long ago that what hackers really wanted was credit card numbers. They were either using credit card number generators at one time, or they were just doing everything they could to steal credit card numbers from databases so that they could use those and make fraudulent purchases. But part of the thing to think about is, what do you think of when you think of a hacker? Is it this? Is it this sort of like dark, sort of hidden guy? Maybe he's working in his bedroom, and I swear that's not my bedroom. But I think this is one of those things that we've seen a lot in popular culture, is that hackers are a guy working at home. Maybe he's in Romania, maybe it doesn't matter where he is, but it's very often sort of a disorganized individual action. But what we're seeing more than ever, and the reason that I include the dark side slide in the presentation as an example, is that these are organizations. They're working in offices, and we're seeing organization charts like this. So this slide came from one of the world's largest cybersecurity conferences in 2019. That conference is called the RSA conference. And what we can see is that we've got our kingpin on the right. So if you want to think of your own organization, this is the owner of the organization. And we've got ops people, and we've got technical IT people, and we've got finance people. And then as we go on down the matrix here, we can see things like mules. These organizations need mules because as money is collected, someone needs to actually cash it and get it out, right? We need people to send spam. We need people to do DevOps, which is like actually making and publishing the software that's used to the web. Because what we see is that these are more like organized crime than individuals in their basement. And just like every other business these days has a very sort of dispersed organization and does outsourcing, maybe you outsource IT or finance, these guys are doing the same thing. These are very organized groups which are performing these hacks. And so that's the first big change, is that this is organized crime doing it. And beyond that, there's a few more things that have really helped to turn this into such a big business. And the first is the payment systems. The fact that we now have access to Bitcoin and Ethereum and all this different cryptocurrency that makes its way into the news in a lot of different ways. The truth about these currencies is that unless it's a very, very major high profile hack, in which case sometimes the FBI is able to recover money, these currencies are untraceable. And so when these companies go out and demand ransoms, they're able to do so in these untraceable currencies. Beyond that, we have a technology called the dark web. All the dark web means is that most of the internet is actually hidden from view. So your company's website, Google, Yahoo, Facebook, these are all sort of above ground. These are like in the light web, so to speak. But the majority of the internet is called the dark web, and is where people can post job postings. Maybe I'm looking for people to help me hack and perform ransoms, or maybe I'm trying to sell data. Every day in the news, when we see that another company was breached and has lost the information. I saw that a major law firm who represents Pfizer, among other people, they were hacked yesterday. And what was taken was personal information. When this personal information is stolen, it's listed for sale on the dark web. So essentially, we have large, globally dispersed, technologically advanced organizations using untraceable payment systems and using the dark web to find people to help them and to sell the information. And so beyond that, why are these people looking to get into your email, steal your email password, and not just steal your credit card? So this is a really good example of it. This happened last year, right before the pandemic started in the US, February 2020. Barbara Corcoran from Shark Tank, someone that we hope has a pretty good business acumen. Someone sent a fake invoice to her bookkeeper, and they sent out almost 400 grand. Now, this is another major risk. Aside from people putting ransom on your computer, and aside from people just sort of sending out emails and making you look bad, people are stealing money. There's a real estate firm that I do some business with. $750,000 was recently sent because an escrow company got hacked. The escrow company's email sent a fraudulent account and routing number, and boom, $750,000. We want to get into emails. Hackers want to get into emails because they can pretend to be whoever's email that is. And then when they're done, now they're going to do this. This is what ransomware looked like. if you were to come into work and see a message like this on your computer, this would not be good. They are often sort of silly and a little bit humorous. All files have been encrypted due to a security problem, right? And so when it says you can write us to the email coronavirus@qq.com, we have how to obtain Bitcoins. They're literally teaching people how to pay in Bitcoin, which many people have never used before. And this kind of covers up their tracks. All the computers and all the servers in the company are now ransomed. So they get in, they pretend to be the bookkeeper, they send fraudulent account info, they get whatever they need, boom. Now they've locked up all the computers in the organization. And what we're seeing more and more is that, Moody's is paying close attention to Pitney Bowes after a ransomware attack. This is starting to impact how these companies are viewed on the public scale. So in 2017, $2.3 million in ransomware payments were sent. That was pretty low, but it was pretty big at the time. 2 years later, in 2019, we were looking at 7.5 billion, right? So 2.3 of these versus 7.5 of these. I know that the numbers have gone way, way up since COVID. I don't have any exact details, but this stuff is on the rise because it's so easy to do. So those are the changes in the global cybercrime business and why phishing is so attractive. And we're going to go into this in more detail in the next section. But one of the main things you can do is learn how to recognize a fraudulent email when it comes. Teach your team that. And secondary, if you see something, say something, whether that means asking your IT team or whether that means telling your staff or whether I've clicked on something, I need to make sure it was okay. It's really a lot about communication in these cases, right? So that's the first section here, just looking at those changes. And the next thing that I want to look at in detail is how we've seen the messaging in phishing attacks changing in the last year and a half. So first off, why does phishing even succeed in the first place? And right, people are really distracted. Now I remember especially at the height of the COVID crisis, back a year and a half ago, people were checking the news all the time, but even today, with everything happening with the climate and with COVID and the economy, people are very, very distracted on a pretty ongoing basis. And that relates to you, that relates to your team. Secondarily, while people are still allowed to work from home, people are doing laundry, kids are crying, all kinds of things are going on at home. People are just very distracted, right? So I think people have been preying on that to really amp up the communication. And when COVID first started, we were seeing a lot of messages like this. This is maybe an easier to spot phishing message, but things that were fake messages from the CDC, talking about the developments with COVID, or messages that were talking about, hey, here's some coronavirus safety measures, random stuff that you can click on. I thought these were pretty easy to spot, but these were some real messages that were going around last year. But this one I see as much more relevant to today, which is that we can send out fake policies, right? Like, again, I just heard of an architecture firm in LA shutting down this week because of a breakthrough COVID case. So it's not a bad time to send out fake HR messages to teams to click on that, hey, we need you to read this, update this, here's the changes to our organization, right? So starting off here, phishing is effective because people are very distracted and a little bit scared, and because there's a lot of timely topics that people can take advantage of to get into people's minds and inboxes. Those are pretty generic phishing messages, but it kind of helps to get a point across. Let's look at the type of phishing. So the first one is called spear phishing. So just like if I'm in the ocean, I'm looking for fish, just sort of, randomly using a spear, trying to find a fish. This is where I email everybody with the same message. I can send a message to tens of thousands of people, cast a very, very wide net, see who clicks. More dangerous, though, is what's called whaling. And what whaling means is that I know your company's organization chart. I know the name of your finance person. I know who you are. I've probably been in the email inboxes of some people in your team. Maybe I've stolen the actual signature in use in your company. And I'm writing from HR to the CFO asking for immediate payment. This is what got Barbara Corcoran and lost that $400,000. We're looking for the big fish in the organization and we're going directly after them. Then we have clone phishing, which is just these messages that come saying, maybe you have a delivery that's stuck. Can you click here to accept that delivery, right? We see them from FedEx, from Amazon. We see it from Microsoft. Your password has expired. Please click here to renew it. So these are the kind of things that we're seeing there. But the bottom line, the reason it's called phishing to begin with is because all phishing has great bait. And the idea here is that great bait is going to be emotional. So you've won, you've lost. We're really capitalizing on the emotions. A really, really big one is urgency. I mean, one of the most successful phishing messages that I've ever seen is ones that talk about your email account is full and you will no longer receive mail until you click here. Everyone wants to get email. Business is coming in email. Money is coming in email. People are going to click that and be convinced. Next up, it's got to be believable. Just like, why does counterfeit currency work? Because it looks like a $100 bill and we want a $100 bill. And as long as it looks enough like a $100 bill, then we're likely to accept that fake currency. And people are falling for this stuff because they're distracted and anxious and tired and stressed out and rushed. People are doing too much. They're doing it from home. They're doing it from the road. There's too much going on. And the bottom line is it's been a very, very nervous time in the world. People are scared. So this is showing us sort of what type of messaging has been working the best in phishing messages. I work with the firm who evaluates the sort of most common phishing messages every month. And these are actually what we're seeing going out. It's just really, really easy to capitalize on people's distraction. So what can we do? What can we do as an architecture firm to prevent some of this stuff? So the first one is identify in advance who is going to give updates to your team, right? So maybe you say that it's going to be your operations manager who's going to provide any updates about HR policies, changes. It's only going to happen over Microsoft Teams. It's never going to happen by email, and it's only going to happen in the HR updates channel on Teams. So now if my people get an email telling them there's a new HR policy, they're not going to look at it. The second is sharing stories with your team. So before we said, if you see something, say something. That's like if you actually get hacked. But share stories with your team. And one of the things that I really like to stress is that this is not just about work. Like a couple weeks ago, I was with my girlfriend and she received a fake book message from my mom's Facebook account asking her to watch a video. This is like, you know, my mom's Facebook got hacked and then she just sent a bunch of messages to everyone that was known, right? Share these stories so people know that this is an impact in your personal life and it's not just impacting your work life. This is a good thing to train yourself and your team is not to just click on a link. If you hover your mouse over the links, you can see the little window that pops up actually telling you where it's going to go. And you can actually right click and copy and then paste those links into your browser. And that's going to give you a really good opportunity to know where you're going rather than just clicking. And the best thing about that is that you slow down, right? So when you're talking to your firm's finance department, teach them to really consider every invoice email before it comes in. Something that I see a lot in architecture firms is that firms will receive fake RFPs, sort of saying that there's a new project that someone is looking for help on. And you know what I've seen owners of firms do is tell them, we never receive legitimate RFPs in a link to click in an email, right? Slow down. Is this actually how we receive RFPs? Is this what invoices look like from our vendors, right? So as we really consider why it's so attractive for people to do this phishing and how much money globally is behind it, the type of sophistication behind it, and the messaging that people are using based on this time that we're living through right now, it's really, really important to go slow so that you're not letting all these sophisticated actors get into your network. So beyond that, we want to look at why free Wi-Fi is often the yellow brick road to an attack. And what we mean is it's a very easy, pleasant way to break in. Now, I made this deck earlier this year, but one of my favorite technology blogs called Lifehacker just today had a post about if you're staying in a hotel, you have to use a VPN. So when is the last time you connected to a public Wi-Fi? And what I like about doing this talk today is maybe unlike when I first started giving this talk, you have connected to a public Wi-Fi. Maybe you've had an opportunity to go to a coffee shop or a hotel, which people didn't have for so long. So think about when you last connected to a public Wi-Fi, and were you looking at your email, right? You're thinking, I'm just looking at my email. I'm not looking at my bank account, right? But as someone watching, what could the risk be? Well, how did they get Barbara Corcoran? Because they were able to break into her finance team's email. So this is why doing something as simple as using a VPN can be very, very helpful. One of the things I've seen a lot in hotels, in airports, I know all of you have seen this, is you'll see a network that says free Wi-Fi network. And sometimes it's really legitimate. Sometimes someone is really being good and creating a Wi-Fi network. But the thing that I want to show is that anyone can create a free Wi-Fi network. They get their regular Windows laptop, they connect it to the internet, maybe they connect to the airport or the hotel Wi-Fi, and then they just turn on another Wi-Fi radio on their computer. Like, this is not high tech. Anyone can do this with any computer. And what do? They call that second network Starbucks free Wi-Fi. And what that means now is everything you do on your computer is sent through that other person's computer, and they can see any pictures you download, they can see passwords you type in. They're basically reading everything you're doing, and they're able to see who you're emailing and get the context that they would need to be able to do a business email compromise attack and trick someone on your team into sending an invoice. So really want to watch out for free Wi-Fi. And the thing is, maybe this is a little less important if you're just at Panera Bread down the street, but if you're in a lounge at the airport, that's really where you want to think about. If you're somewhere where business people are, that's what you want to think about. So the same thing, if you're just staying at a Holiday Inn, somewhere random with your family, maybe not such a big deal. But as we're getting back to conferences, this is where these attacks are happening. And this is where they know that there's tens of thousands of business people who are able to do, who are doing their work, who are getting on their email, who are doing financial stuff, and they want to steal. So what can you do about this? So the first one is that anywhere where your AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile cell phone, if you have a good signal on your phone, you can turn on your personal hotspot, right? Which is pretty much free with every cell phone plan. And I know that you can't do that everywhere, but often you just turn on that personal hotspot button on your iPhone or whatever it looks like on your Android phone. And now that's your own internet connection. No one can see what's going on inside that connection, right? So use a hotspot, don't connect to free Wi-Fi. And the other one, this is totally free. And if you only get one thing from my presentation today, use two-factor authentication. Two-factor authentication so that a 6-digit code is needed before logging into your email or logging into your cloud file server or your bank or whatever it is. So use two-factor authentication. And we'll provide a guide when we're done with this that'll show you how to turn it on for a lot of the main email and social media services. But this is preventing, according to Microsoft, probably about 90% of hacks these days. If you have this on, it is about 90% harder for your accounts to get hacked. And then finally, start using a VPN. And we're not going to go into much detail about this, but if you use a VPN, what it means in translation is that the technical term is a tunnel, but it also works as a descriptive term. You get a tunnel so that anyone looking at your traffic, what you're doing on the internet, all they see is gibberish. Inside that tunnel is where the actual sensitive data is traveling. So by using two-factor authentication, even if someone steals your password, they can't log in without a code that they don't have. And by using a VPN, no one can see what you're doing anyway. And so it is much more secure. So we just looked at sort of the progression of cybercrime in 2021, how it's changed, how hackers are exploiting this crisis, and how as the world opens up, using free Wi-Fi can really be a major risk. And I really want to stress the free Wi-Fi thing as you're allowing your employees to work from home, because we don't know where employees are working, and we want to be really careful that where these folks are working is not somewhere where they can be observed and have their data stolen. So moving out of that, I want to look at some very specific things to the AEC industry that I think are really important to pay attention to as firm owners and as designers. And so the first one is really understanding the compliance needs of each of your projects. So like we have a client that does work for the FBI. And as part of doing that work for the FBI, they have to be really careful that only certain people in their firm are allowed to view that file. And in that case, the FBI's primary concern is the country of origin of the designers. But what we see otherwise is on certain types of government compliance, we need to keep files for longer. We need to keep different types of documentation. And we really have to tune our technology to work for that. So if we need to keep files for a certain project longer, IT needs to know about that. The second thing is that as architects, this may be something being done by one of your subs, but as you build buildings these days, we're building computer-enabled digital buildings, right? Whether that be digital HVAC systems, or whether that be digital elevator controllers, or the systems that are opening doors, closing doors, whatever it might be. There's a lot of technology actually coming into buildings. And I think to be responsible stewards as architects, it's really important to start bringing up cybersecurity considerations, because these are major risks. I think about the hotel in Las Vegas a couple of years ago that got hacked because someone hacked into their digital aquarium. Like, this stuff really happens, and it's really important to think about. Third, I mean, this goes without saying, is designing really good systems to store your data and back it up. When a ransomware attack happens, the primary thing that goes on is that all your data is encrypted, is taken away from you. And if you have a backup, it's a lot easier to recover from that. Now, what's starting to happen now too is that people are stealing data and threatening to leak it on the internet. Obviously, backups won't help with that, but especially if you're not dealing with particularly sensitive information, then as long as you have a backup, it's a lot easier to deal with the ransomware. Fourth is that it's really important, the type of training that we're doing today, you want to educate your team. Everyone on your team needs to act like a human firewall. And just because they're an architect or a designer does not also mean that they don't have a responsibility to protect your business. Fifth, the vendors who actually hold your data. So if you're working out of the cloud in some way, whether that be through Autodesk Docs or through Ignite, or maybe through Dropbox or Microsoft, you need to tune those systems so that you have a record of everything that's going on. So you see who's opened what, who's downloaded what. And if you're working on more sensitive projects identified in number one here, if you're working on more sensitive projects, you may need to know if someone has viewed an entire project when they weren't supposed to and get alerts for that. Really important. Number six, you've got people working in the field, right? They're working on phones, they're working on tablets, they're taking pictures. Like, is that okay on their own phone? Are they supposed to use a company device, only use a company iPad? It's really important to think about, because you're enabling access to all your information in the cloud. The last two here, they're a little less AEC specific, but I talked about two-factor authentication. You also want to use really hard to guess passwords, like no more like P @ $$ W0RD, not a good password. Use hard to guess passwords and long passwords. And finally, do a vulnerability analysis. Really figure out, what are my risks? What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? Right? So these are some things you can do as a firm to really show, tell yourself, help you sleep a little better at night, but also to prove to your insurance company that you've kind of covered all your bases. and done everything that you can to prevent hacks. So I'm going to go through one more piece, but I don't know, does anybody have any questions? Is there anything anybody would like to know about? Anything we can clarify here? Definitely would love to, help sort of clarify any questions. But if we don't have any questions, I think the last thing that I really want to cover today, and before I start on this, if something comes up to you, feel free to hop in. This is interactive, happy to answer any questions. But one more thing that you can do is get a free cybersecurity network assessment. This is something that we can come in and offer. We don't always offer this for free, but through the AIA, we're happy to do a couple of these this month. And I don't know kind of what everyone's role is who is on this call, but not sure if you're necessarily the right person for this to make this decision, but it's really your job, whoever you are, to help keep your company safe. And at this point, we want to make sure that even if you think you're completely protected, that you are actually completely protected. The best thing that we can do in this case is to sort of confirm for you that you're protected and not sort of, missing anything. Let me go ahead real quick and answer Michael's question before I move on here. Michael says, so I get a lot of these emails. I look at them to determine if they are phishing emails or not. Is that dangerous to do? So the answer to that question is you can definitely look at the emails. Now, there is some incredibly rare cases, and I'm actually bringing this up because it's in the news today. There's an Israeli firm called Pegasus who made spyware, which was being sent to people's cell phones and hacking them without even clicking on a link. It is possible. And if you are being specifically targeted in such an intense way, there's probably a conceivable chance where looking at an email could get you hacked. But no, mostly look at the email, read the email, look at who it's actually from, hover your mouse over the links, because you have to have some way to evaluate it, right? But if you can tell from the subject that it's fishy, just delete it. And now going back to what I'm talking about here with the protection, are you completely protected? You might consider, Michael, why these emails are getting through into your inbox in the first place. There are solutions that are designed to sit as a firewall and block these phishing emails from getting in. But essentially, you're okay to read emails unless you're being hacked by the Israeli government, in which case I might not be able to help you. But going back to these cyber scans, do we need to get your IT department involved? No, the scans we do not require any administrative credentials or passwords. If you want to run a quick link that we provide to help you get a sense of how your company is protected, we can do that without IT, without passwords, and without installing anything. So if anyone does want to talk about getting one of these scheduled, Miriam put our info on the chat. We're happy to help out. But basically, all we do is analyze your network, meet with you to review the results, give you some steps you can do to protect your data. The whole thing takes less than an hour. It's really pretty simple. And I guess the question is, what's the catch? And the catch is we just can't do that many because we're a small company. So if you want to do this, please let us know. We're happy to help. I really am trying to secure and streamline technology for 100 organizations. Architects really are our favorite folks to work with. And if you're not ready to do that, we do have a bit.ly you can run to, but also I'm going to give this guide to the AIA when they send out the recording. We have a quick work from home cybersecurity employee guide with some tips so you can take what we've talked about today and provide it to your team. And Michael, one of the things I'm going to give to provide as well is a guide with a breakdown you can use about actually evaluating whether a message is phishing or not, which I think is a really good thing to prepare your team, because there's 40 or 50 different cues that you can use to decide if a message is phishing or not. And as long as we're very clear that we're not clicking, we're just reading, educating people to be able to get through that is really, really important. So I'm kind of done here. Got through it a little bit fast, but I am happy to take any more questions if anybody has any. Not sure if anyone from the AIA side has any questions that they want to provide.
Yeah, so I'll start off with the questions. And like Josh said, if you have any questions, please type those in the chat box. But I'll start off with how can firms protect staff laptops if they're designing outside of the office?
So that's a really interesting question, and I'm gonna want to go into that without recommending any specific products. I don't really want to come here trying to sell anything in particular. Um, what I want to talk about is the concept that has emerged over the last couple of years, which is called zero trust. And what zero trust means is that you kind of assume that everyone has already been hacked. You assume that whatever network your employees from working from is not safe. And what happens is software can be installed that is sort of like a VPN. And the way I like to describe it is it puts the staff computers in their own little company bubble so that that computer is allowed to access the internet, but it can't do anything on the local network. Because one of the things that we're really afraid of is that maybe your son is, downloading some computer game from a shady site. And, if anyone on the network is doing something bad, they can infect the computers. So it's looking into a zero trust solution or a VPN solution, some way that you can sort of put the computers some way that you can kind of put the computers into their own little bubbles. And so what I recommend looking into is a business focused VPN. You can do your research. I'm happy to talk to anyone offline about that, but really for the purpose of this meeting, the main thing to think about is putting a protective mechanism in place. And the other thing to think about is using those tools to actually limit what those staff computers are allowed to do. Like maybe you don't want people using staff computers to be able to look for another job. Or maybe you don't want people using staff computers to go on the dark web that I mentioned earlier. By creating that bubble, we choose what can get into the computer, and we also can choose what's allowed to leave the computer. Going to a question that's in the chat from Victor, how much risk does a small firm, 1 to 3 people, face? Depends on a couple different things. The first one being, who are you working with? Right? If you're working on very unsensitive projects, then your risk is less. So the first thing is really thinking, what would your current clients think if you lost access to their data for a week or a couple weeks, or if their data got leaked on the internet? The next thing to think about is your financial risk. Like, what would the risk be if all of your computers were locked up and you and your team could not work until you had rebuilt all that stuff from scratch? And I know that, for a small team, it can take a while to get an architecture workstation set up with all of your AutoCAD standards and everything in place. So you have the reputational risk of what your clients will think. You have the technology sort of financial risk of what happens if you're not able to do design or business work on your computers for a certain amount of time. And then you have the financial risk that if you did not have a good backup in place, would you want to pay a Bitcoin ransom to get all of your data back? So I have absolutely, truly spoken to clients of ours who have 3 employees who are architects who basically say, yeah, I understand the risk. It's not a big deal to me. And I think that that's totally appropriate. I think especially if your data is in the cloud and you trust it, then you're basically saying that there's a small chance I might have some downtime. I can accept that risk. And that really helps you to sort of put a dollar amount and a sort of risk factor in place. And then Michael says, you scared me about personal cell phones. How does a firm protect itself short of buying everyone new cell phones? But I don't see how even doing that helps. How does it help? I did mention Pegasus on this call. I think it's important to mention that, like, the cover of the paper today says that Emmanuel Macron, the head of France, was the target of that attack. Like, this is where we have to say the risk of a 1 to 3 person firm is a lot different than if you are the leader of France. So I don't think that an architecture firm has to worry that much about everyone's cell phones unless you are working for the FBI 100% unless you're working only on very, very compliance-driven projects, in which case you actually would want to employ what I spoke about. You would want to employ what's called zero trust, even on the employees' cell phones. There's a strategy along that line that we take on computers, which is called application whitelisting. It is, if you really want to prevent ransomware, you allow absolutely no software to run whatsoever at all, unless it's explicitly approved. So I'm going to imagine, Michael, you don't have to do this on your employees' cell phones because you're probably not the target of international espionage. But there are things you can do if you're legitimately worried that we could talk about more offline. But, you know, I'm really not here to fearmonger or scare people. Like, we're mostly trying to cover the 80% basics to keep you as safe as possible, not necessarily protecting you from like targeted international espionage. And I don't know that you need to be specifically concerned about that either. So I hope that that's helpful to you. Don't, you know, there's a reasonable amount of fear here to have, but I wouldn't go overboard either. Unless maybe you're doing design for the government of France.
And Josh, if it's okay, I'll ask one more question. Should companies pay the ransom if they get ransomware?
This is a really interesting question. If at all possible, the answer is no. If it is possible not to pay it, it's really important not to pay it. What we're seeing happen is that the more people that get hacked and pay, the more attractive this type of crime is to the ransomware operators. So if we were doing this presentation 1 year ago, the answer would be as long as you have good backups, then don't pay the ransom because you have your data anyway. Now that what's happening is that people are threatening extortion. They're saying we have all your records and we're going to post them online. Sometimes companies are paying the ransom because the ransomware gangs are offering to delete all their data if they pay the ransom. The question is, are they really going to delete your data even if you pay the ransom? There's a lot of chain of thought on this that they're probably going to leak your data anyway. So what I continue to tell people is if you don't have backups, pay the ransom. That's obvious. And if you do have backups and you're scared about the extortion, speak with your insurance company, speak with your attorney, and get very, very clear on your risk and whether you have to pay or not, because it is always better not to pay, as attractive as it can be to pay. So that's where I'll leave that. And I guess really all that said, thank you all for joining me today. This is something that I'm really, really passionate about, spreading this education. And I hope that you can both take this to your firms and your team. And I am going to get to the last question I just saw coming in. I hope that you can take this to your firms and your team. And I hope that you can share this with your families, because this stuff applies to your vacation photos and to sort of your kids' music collections and to just everything is digital now. And I guess we can end on this kind of crazy note. Michael says, why aren't law enforcement doing more? And I think it goes back to the beginning of this presentation where I talk about Bitcoin and the internationally dispersed cyber gang sort of cybercrime culture. This is happening everywhere. I mean, right now there's a lot of politics happening between Joe Biden saying to Russia and to Putin that they need to do more because a lot of these attacks are originating in Russia. But the bottom line is that this has happened. This is not necessarily a US issue. This isn't like there's someone down the street in downtown LA who's doing these hacks and we can just figure out who they are and arrest them. These are internationally dispersed organizations, and they're using very, very hard to track currencies like Bitcoin. So there's issues of who is the perpetrator to begin with. And then there's issues of jurisdiction. And then you know, maybe they could do more. And I think that with the most recent spate of attacks, with Microsoft getting hacked back in January, with a very, very large IT management software getting hacked just 2 weeks ago, it's possible we're going to see more getting done, and we're going to test out the validity of what I'm saying, that nothing can be done because it's so hard. But so far, it's that there is so much of it, most of it never gets reported, and you have traceability and jurisdiction issues that just make it very, very hard to actually do something in the first place. And I mean, the reason that I teach these courses is that I want you to be well protected, because law enforcement really does not do that much. And, you know, if you speak to the FBI because you get a ransomware attack, probably they're just going to help you negotiate the ransom. So, you know, and that's going to cost you money. So at the end of the day, there's just not a lot being done because it's hard, and perhaps because of a lack of political will. But it's harder for me to speak to that piece. So I think all that said, I hope you have all a wonderful afternoon. I hope this wasn't too scary. I really hope that this is empowering. Pretty much everything I talked about on this call can be done without spending a dime. There are great tools to purchase, but really what we're talking about today is awareness and education, and sort of not using free Wi-Fi. So I don't want this to seem too scary. This is all stuff that can be done. And if you do need help analyzing how you're doing things or how to get help, we're here to help. But, you know, just take this and do what you can. Stay safe.